You are standing on a field of wet grass. Before you, an army. Not just any army. 20,000 men. A sea of steel and polished armor. The largest force England has ever sent to crush you. You have 3,000. Farmers, woodsmen, a handful of disgraced knights. The odds aren't just bad, they are impossible. A 7-to-1 slaughter in the making. Any sane commander would surrender, but Robert the Bruce was not sane. He was a genius, and he wasn't planning to fight a battle. He was planning to set a trap that would turn this field into a butcher's yard and change the course of history forever.
So how did it come to this? It all started with a promise and a deadline. Stirling Castle, the great stone heart of Scotland, was under siege. For months, its Scottish defenders had held out, but now they were starving. The castle's commander, Sir Philip de Mowbray, had made a deal with the English. If an English army couldn't relieve the siege by Midsummer's Day 1314, he would surrender the castle. It was a challenge King Edward II of England could not ignore. To fail would be a catastrophic humiliation. He gathered his forces, calling upon every lord, every knight, every banner in his kingdom. He assembled a magnificent host, a spectacle of medieval military power. Knights in shining armor, thousands of deadly longbowmen, and a baggage train miles long filled with supplies, wine, and even the royal court. This wasn't just a relief force, it was an invasion. It was meant to be the final crushing blow in the long and bitter war for Scotland's independence. If you're fascinated by these moments where history hangs on a thread, make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. For Robert the Bruce, the self-proclaimed King of Scots, this was the ultimate gamble. For years he had been a fugitive, a guerrilla warrior hiding in the Highlands and Islands. He had slowly, painfully won back his kingdom piece by piece, but he had never faced the full might of England in open battle. His army was a fraction of Edward's. He had no longbowmen to speak of, and his cavalry was a mere 500 horsemen against thousands of the most feared knights in Christendom. His advisors pleaded with him, avoid battle, fade back into the hills, harass the English supply lines. It was the sensible strategy, the only strategy. But Bruce knew that another retreat would shatter the morale of his men and the fragile unity of the Scottish lords. He had to make a stand. He had to fight. But he would not fight on Edward's terms. He would choose the ground. He would make the terrain itself his greatest weapon. The ground Bruce chose was a masterpiece of tactical foresight. Just south of Stirling, the path of the old Roman road was squeezed into a narrow corridor. To the east lay a treacherous, marshy plain called the Carse. To the west, a dense forest. The English army, with its vast numbers and heavy cavalry, would be forced to advance through this bottleneck. Their numerical superiority would mean nothing if they couldn't deploy. But Bruce didn't stop there. He decided to improve upon nature's design. He ordered his men to dig hundreds of small, knee-deep pits across the open ground where the English cavalry were most likely to charge. These pits, called pots, were then camouflaged with branches and turf. They were an ancient tactic, designed not just to stop a charge, but to break the legs of the war horses and throw their riders into a chaotic, mangled heap. It was a brutal, ugly, but brilliant way to neutralize the single greatest threat he faced. Even with the terrain to his advantage, Bruce needed a way to hold his line. His infantry, mostly commoners with little armor, would be no match for a direct cavalry charge. His solution was the schiltron. Imagine a giant moving hedgehog made of men and steel. Hundreds of soldiers packed tightly together, presenting a solid wall of overlapping iron-tipped spears, some up to 15 feet long.
It was a defensive formation, a fortress of flesh and wood. Any horse charging it would be impaled. Any knight trying to break through would be met with a dozen spear points. The schiltrons were difficult to maneuver and vulnerable to archers, but in a confined space against a frontal assault, they were nearly unbreakable. Bruce drilled his men relentlessly, turning these formations of farmers and shepherds into disciplined killing machines. They were the anchor of his entire plan. On June 23rd, the English vanguard arrived. They saw the Scottish army arrayed on the high ground, small and seemingly insignificant. To the English knights, this was an insult. These Scottish rebels dared to offer battle? The Earls of Gloucester and Hereford, leading the vanguard, decided to end the war right there and then. Ignoring King Edward's orders to make camp, they spurred their horses forward. They saw a small figure riding in front of the Scottish lines, a crown on his helmet, wielding a battle axe. It was Robert the Bruce himself. This was their chance to capture or kill the rebel king and win eternal glory. The stage was set for one of the most famous duels in history. An English knight, Sir Henry de Bohun, saw his chance. He was the nephew of the Earl of Hereford, a young, powerful warrior eager to make a name for himself. Seeing Bruce so exposed, he lowered his heavy lance and charged. It was the ultimate mismatch, a fully armored knight on a massive warhorse against a lightly armored king on a small palfrey. De Bohun's charge was a thunderbolt of steel, aimed to skewer the Scottish king. Bruce's men watched in horror. But as the knight closed the distance, Bruce remained calm. At the very last second, he expertly swerved his horse aside. As de Bohun thundered past, unable to stop, Bruce stood up in his stirrups and brought his battle axe down with incredible force, splitting the knight's helmet and skull in two. The blow was so powerful, it shattered the axe's wooden shaft. For a moment, there was silence. Then the entire Scottish army erupted. Their king had just faced down the best England had to offer and had slain him with a single blow. It was a titanic boost to their morale, a sign from God himself. When Bruce returned to his commanders, they admonished him for taking such a foolish risk. According to legend, the king simply looked at his broken weapon and lamented, "I have broken my good battle axe." This single act of personal bravery electrified his army and sowed the first seeds of doubt among the overconfident English. The war had just begun, but the first psychological blow had been struck by the rebel king. While the duel captured everyone's attention, another part of the English vanguard was making a second critical error. A force of several hundred knights under Robert Clifford and Henry de Beaumont tried to outflank the Scottish position, riding between the Bannockburn and the treacherous Carse to cut off the Scots' escape route to Stirling. But Bruce had anticipated this. He had stationed a schiltron under the command of his nephew, the Earl of Moray, hidden in the woods nearby. As the English knights picked their way across the boggy ground, Moray's schiltron emerged from the trees and moved to intercept them. The English, seeing a seemingly vulnerable block of infantry, charged. It was a disaster. The horses couldn't build up speed on the soft ground, and they crashed uselessly against the wall of spears. Knights were unhorsed, impaled, and the charge dissolved into a chaotic melee where the long Scottish spears had a decisive advantage. The English cavalry, battered and humiliated, were forced to retreat. They had lost men, horses, and, most importantly, their auroch of invincibility. Twice on the first day, England's elite heavy cavalry, the most feared weapon on the medieval battlefield, had been defeated by a smaller, poorly equipped Scottish force. The traps Bruce had laid, both the physical pits and the disciplined schiltrons, had worked perfectly. As night fell, the English army was demoralized. They had been forced to camp in the Carse, the low-lying marshy ground, a terrible position that restricted their movement. The Scots, meanwhile, held the high ground, their confidence now sky high. The impossible victory suddenly seemed a little less impossible. That night, according to the chroniclers, Robert the Bruce walked among his men. He knew the next day would be the true test. He reminded them of the years of English oppression, the homes burned, the families destroyed. He spoke not of glory or riches, but of freedom, freedom for their children and their children's children. He told them that any man who did not have the heart to fight could leave now, with no shame. No one would stop them. He offered them a choice, to live as slaves or to stand and fight for a free Scotland. As the sun rose on June 24th, not a single man had left. They had made their choice. They would stand, they would fight, and they would die if necessary, right here on the banks of the Bannockburn.
At dawn, the Scots did the unthinkable. Instead of waiting in their defensive positions, they advanced. Bruce had decided to seize the initiative. 3 massive schiltrons, commanded by his brother Edward Bruce, the Earl of Moray, and the duo of Walter Stewart and James Douglas, began to move out of the woods and down towards the English army. It was an audacious, incredibly risky move. The English, still disorganized and cramped in their poor campsite, were stunned. They had expected the Scots to cower on the hill. Instead, this forest of spears was coming right for them. A frantic scramble began as knights rushed to find their horses and armor, and commanders tried to form a battle line in the confined space.
As the schiltrons advanced, they paused, and the entire army knelt as one to say a short prayer. From the English lines, King Edward saw this and famously remarked, "They kneel for mercy." One of his advisors, Ingram de Umfreville, who knew the Scots well, replied, "They ask for mercy, sire, but not from you. They ask it from God for their sins. I tell you truly, these men will win or die." Edward, blinded by arrogance, dismissed the warning. He ordered his trumpets to sound the charge. The flower of English chivalry, led by the impetuous Earl of Gloucester, prepared to smash the Scottish formations once and for all. They were charging directly towards the ground Bruce had so carefully prepared. The ground shook as thousands of English knights charged. It was a sight that should have broken any infantry line in Europe. But this time, it was different. The charge wasn't a clean, thunderous impact. It was a catastrophic, grinding crash. The front ranks of the cavalry slammed headlong into the field of hidden pits. Horses screamed as their legs snapped, throwing their heavily armored riders to the ground. Knights who fell were crushed by the men behind them, who couldn't see the danger until it was too late. The English army's greatest weapon had been utterly broken before it even reached the enemy. Those few knights who navigated the pits now faced the schiltrons. They slammed into the spear wall, a futile wave breaking against a cliff of iron. Lances splintered, horses were impaled, and saddles were emptied. The Scots held firm, their long spears thrusting out from the formation, picking off the knights who were now easy targets, bogged down and unable to maneuver. The Earl of Gloucester, who had foolishly charged without his coat of arms, was surrounded and killed. The English vanguard was being systematically butchered, pressed against the Scottish spears by the weight of their own men still pushing from behind. The glorious charge had become a suicidal crush in a narrow, bloody corridor. Seeing the cavalry charge failing, the English commanders finally brought their trump card into play, the longbowmen. Thousands of archers moved to the flank and began to rain arrows down on the tightly packed Scottish schiltrons. This was the moment Bruce had feared. The schiltrons were terribly vulnerable to arrow fire. Men began to fall, and gaps started to appear in the formations. But Bruce had a plan for this, too. He unleashed his small force of 500 light cavalry, the Mareshal's horsemen, which he had held in reserve. They had one job: neutralize the archers. They charged out from the cover of the woods, crashing into the flank of the longbowmen. The English archers were masters of ranged combat, but they were completely unprepared for a cavalry charge. They wore little to no armor and had only knives or small swords for close quarters fighting. The Scottish horsemen smashed into them with devastating effect. The archers' formations broke instantly. They scattered and fled, their deadly volleys ceasing completely. It was a brilliant, decisive move. By sacrificing his small cavalry force in a targeted strike, Bruce had eliminated the single greatest threat to his infantry. With the English archers out of the fight, the battle was now a brutal, grinding infantry struggle, exactly the fight Bruce wanted. The battle devolved into a horrific close-quarters slugfest. The entire Scottish line, all three schiltrons, pushed forward as one, a single massive killing machine. The English infantry, mostly spearmen and men-at-arms, were packed so tightly together in the narrow space that many couldn't even lift their arms to fight effectively. They were being crushed by the pressure from behind and systematically slaughtered by the forest of Scottish spears at the front. The ground became slick with blood. The screams of men and horses filled the air. The English line began to buckle, not from a lack of courage, but from the sheer, relentless pressure and the horrific casualties they were taking. At this critical moment, a new force appeared on a hill overlooking the battlefield. It was the Scottish camp followers, the sma folk, the servants, cooks, and baggage handlers who had been told to wait in the rear. Seeing the English wavering, they grabbed whatever they could, tying sheets to tent poles to look like banners, and charged down the hill, screaming battle cries. To the exhausted and demoralized English army, it looked like a fresh Scottish reserve force was entering the battle. It was the final straw. The already faltering English line broke completely. Panic is a contagion, and it swept through the English army like wildfire. The disciplined ranks dissolved into a terrified mob. Men threw down their weapons and ran for their lives, but there was nowhere to run. To their back was the Bannockburn, its steep banks creating a deadly bottleneck. To their flank was the marshy Carse. The Scottish schiltrons broke formation and surged forward, the long spears now used to hunt down the fleeing enemy. The battle was over. The slaughter had just begun. Thousands of English soldiers were cut down as they tried to escape, or drowned as they tried to cross the burn. It was a total, catastrophic rout. King Edward II himself was nearly captured. He fought with courage, but his bodyguard, led by the Earl of Pembroke, knew the battle was lost. They grabbed the reins of his horse and physically dragged him from the field. With a contingent of several hundred knights, they fled towards Stirling Castle. But the castle's commander, Sir Philip de Mowbray, knew that surrendering the king with the castle would be folly. He refused Edward entry, telling him to flee while he could. Pursued by Scottish cavalry led by James Douglas, the King of England began a desperate, headlong flight back to the safety of the English border, his magnificent army utterly destroyed behind him. The aftermath was a vision of hell. The Bannockburn was said to be choked with the bodies of men and horses. The field was littered with the dead and dying. The English losses were catastrophic. While exact numbers are impossible to know, it's estimated that thousands of infantry were killed and hundreds of knights, the very heart of England's military aristocracy, were either slain or captured. The Scottish losses, by contrast, were remarkably light. Robert the Bruce had not just defeated the English army, he had annihilated it. The entire baggage train, filled with treasure, weapons, and supplies worth a fortune, fell into Scottish hands. It was one of the most lopsided and decisive victories in medieval history.
The number of high-ranking prisoners taken by the Scots was astonishing. The Earl of Hereford, along with numerous other earls, barons, and bannerets, were captured. This was a massive windfall for Scotland. Bruce ransomed them back to England for huge sums of money, which funded his kingdom for years to come. More importantly, he traded the Earl of Hereford for his own wife, daughter, and sister, who had been held captive in England for 8 long years. In a single stroke, Bruce had destroyed his enemy's army, secured his family, and filled his treasury. He treated the captured nobles with chivalry and respect, a calculated move to show that he was not some rebel chieftain, but a true and rightful king. The news of Bannockburn sent shockwaves across Europe. For England, it was a national humiliation of the highest order. King Edward II's authority was shattered, and he would spend the rest of his reign dealing with rebellious barons, eventually leading to his own deposition and gruesome death. For Scotland, the victory was everything. It didn't end the war. That would drag on for another 14 years, but it made Scottish independence a reality on the ground. It proved that the Scots could defeat the English in open battle. It solidified Robert the Bruce's position as the undisputed King of Scots and united the nation behind him in a way that nothing else could have.
The Battle of Bannockburn became a cornerstone of Scottish national identity. It was the ultimate underdog story, a tale of how cunning, courage, and a refusal to yield could triumph against overwhelming odds. The schiltron, the formation of common men with long spears, became a powerful symbol of Scottish defiance. It represented the idea that the collective will of the people, standing together, could defeat the might of a feudal aristocracy. The battle was immortalized in poems and songs, most famously in the Declaration of Arbroath and later in the poem Scots Wha Hae by Robert Burns, which became the unofficial national anthem.
So how did it happen? How did 3,000 men slaughter an army of 20,000? It wasn't luck. It was genius. The genius of a commander who understood his own army's strengths and weaknesses, and those of his enemy. Robert the Bruce used the terrain to nullify England's greatest assets, its heavy cavalry and longbowmen. He used deception with the camouflaged pits and discipline with the unbreakable schiltrons. He controlled the battlefield from the very beginning, forcing the English to fight the battle he wanted them to fight on the ground of his choosing. He combined the strategic brilliance with incredible personal courage, inspiring his men to believe that the impossible was achievable.
The Battle of Bannockburn was more than just a military victory. It was the violent, bloody birth of a nation. It ensured that Scotland would remain an independent kingdom for the next 400 years. It was a lesson written in blood on the fields of Stirling that numbers alone do not win wars. Vision, strategy, and the unbreakable spirit of people fighting for their freedom can overcome even the most impossible odds. What do you think was the most critical factor in the Scottish victory? Was it the terrain, the schiltrons, or Bruce's leadership? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.